one of the things that people don't understand or have a hard time getting through is like the time suckage thing, how long it takes to actually do something. And when it comes to like vendor management, I like to throw the ISPs underneath the bus because they're pretty easy to do so, but also they're massive time suckage. So when I have this conversation of like who's doing your vendor management, typically it's like the operations manager that's dealing with it, maybe the owner that's dealing with this vendor management. And there's a common response when I ask like, hey, who's dealing with the ISP? And I get the eyes kind of rolling back in the back of their head. I'm like, yes, I get it. You probably, every time you have to call them, you'd rather, shoot yourself or,
Yeah.
place destroying yourself XYZ right here. Because it's hours of your time. Like you just assume the moment you pick up the phone, you've got 2 hours of pulling your hair out until you actually get to the person that you want to talk to that can solve your problem. And even then they may not be able to solve it. So when you have your operations manager or your owner or higher level people, those are some of the most expensive people in your organization, and they're not necessarily qualified to hop on those calls. Like the vendor's probably asking them questions that they can't answer. And so going back to having IT doing functions that they're qualified for and trained for, I'm going to tell you, I can do it for 5 times less than an operations manager or an owner. That's just the math that it works out. I
Yeah.
can always do it for cheaper because I have somebody that's trained in that position to be able to do that. So having your most expensive employee doing some of these functions costs money. Whether it shows
Yeah.
up on a P&L or not is a different story, but it's expensive.
Yeah, and
So,
before we move on to the next one, Tony, I know
yeah.
we're on this webinar. We're working to have like really practical examples. So Grant mentioned 2 hours. So I will tell you that probably 2 hours is pretty conservative as far as how long it takes to get an ISP to fix an issue. Like we usually sit on the phone for an hour on hold before we even get to anybody. So let's assume that this one person in your office has spent 4 hours like dealing with the issue. They make $35 an hour. So like you got $140 of employee cost into that phone call, right? And hopefully they resolved it. That was probably impacting all the staff at some level because your internet wasn't working right. So, multiply that amount of time by those people. And, you take on top of that what it would cost, like what that employee would have produced in value for the organization, right? Doing their real job. So all of a sudden, like vendor management's really expensive. So you're going to have like a couple $100 to $500 per one of these events. So you then start to add those up day after day after day or month after month, and you're burning cash, right? You're bleeding cash that you can't see. So as you go through these, I'm going to kind of highlight the math equation for each one of these.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I think it's worth getting people to think that way because we don't. We're like, oh, what came out of my bank account today? Or, what
Mm-hmm.
I made, what do I got to make to, make payroll? Oh, I made payroll. Everything's, everything's going great. Or, I'm not underwater. And so you have kind of this survival mentality where you step over, a dollar to get to a nickel. Like, oh, I'll do this myself because I'm saving money. I'm not paying somebody. But you're depending on how proficient you are at these things, your time should be spent doing something else.
Well, like I said,
It
an
takes
owner,
the right mindset.
yeah, an owner or management member are some of the most expensive people in your organization. So those people doing those types of remedial tasks is a really expensive way to solve that problem. And back to Andrew, back to your comment, I'm going to continue to lowball numbers all the way through this webinar. The reason why is that the equation works itself out, right? So me pointing out that it maybe takes 2 hours, they're like, wow, it probably took me 4. So I want to make sure that when the numbers stick out, even in the lowball numbers, that they really understand that the multiplier is where you have to pay attention to. And you'll see it down throughout the call, but it's the math is undeniable.
We should really call it the invisible IT bleed. because that's what happens. It's not in a bank account somewhere or on a check somewhere. And so it seems like it's invisible, but there's a cost there.
Yeah.
So talk to me a little bit about licensing management. What does that mean?
So I can take that one. So as we get into a world, as the world changes more to a subscription and licensing model for software, now we're all paying monthly, right? We're paying for what we consume. We're paying per license or per site, per processor, depending on your licensing. So all of a sudden, what was previously like a once every 3 or 4 or 5 year purchase for like a fixed license or like a perpetual license, we're now paying monthly for a subscription license. There's a couple of things here that this is where the bleeding really happens. So now, before, you were having an approval process because the perpetual license was expensive, and people had to really think about it and make a decision to buy it. The subscription licensing now has become so commonplace that there's no one who's really looking at that on a regular basis, because they're like, I can't manage all these licenses. I can't be aware of all of them for every time I have a new employee or an employee goes. And so the accounts payable team just pays the bill, right? So the gates are now open for money to flow out, whereas they were like a really solid approval process previously. The vendors also, and I'll use some examples, but like 2 of the biggest vendors out there that we all buy licensing from have models that make it really hard to keep track of your licensing. So like, Microsoft 365, which we do a ton of business with, the majority of your licensing with them is an annual commitment. If you miss that annual commitment and you get renewed, like you're stuck in that licensing for a year. You may only have 10 employees, but now you have 20 licenses you're shouldering. So
Right.
You're basically doubling your cost because no one could see what was going on. No one was watching it. There's another vendor, which I will not say their name because I think this is a dirty trick that they play, but they advertise individual licenses for their productivity software that are less expensive. And everyone buys the less expensive individual license because they're like, oh, I'm going to buy the less expensive license. What happens, though, is every time one of those licenses is purchased, a credit card is put on file to back up that cost. And so the accounts payable person sees like transaction after transaction after transaction each month for this type of licensing. And there's just so much of it that they like give up, right? So they're just like, I'll just pay the bill. Well, the employee leaves, and that license was associated with that employee. And that license is usually an annual commitment, but it's tied to that employee's email address. The employee leaves, their email gets wiped away, the license is now orphaned. And accounts payable just keeps paying. And so what we've found is when we get into those situations for this specific vendor, we know we actually go through a process of finding all their orphaned licensing, because the customer will say, like, you guys have to figure out our licensing for this vendor. And so we go and find all the orphaned licensing, roll it into the more expensive Teams account, and then we can see everything and we can allocate licenses more effectively. But if you look at it from that standpoint, like if you're paying $40 a month for a license that no one's using and you multiply that by 5, 10, 20, you're bleeding cash and getting no value from it.
Well, so before I pull up the third one, we'll have a chance to go into each one of these and start talking like practical approach and how to look at it. So we'll get a dive in it. We'll do some math. But I just wanted people to understand kind of the top 3 that we see. And this one is a big one. We've already mentioned it a little bit, this employee inefficiency. And it tends to be around the technology they're using and how well that technology is working, i.e. computers, or it could be software, but most of the time it's computers or a network, that makes them slow. Although, Grant, you brought up a point when we were kind of prepping for the conversation about everybody's sold that they need more bandwidth, and that might not necessarily be the truth. And that one kind of floored me a little bit. I was like, oh, I'm that guy.
Well,
I'm the guy that just
I mean,
goes,
that's what
yeah,
they're
buy
sold.
more, man. Give me more pipe, babe.
That's what they're sold, right? The ISP says, I'm going to give you more bandwidth. And ironically enough, bandwidth is the one part of the equation that doesn't necessarily equal speed. Speed comes from latency or low latency and low jitter. Most people run like, I mean, you got your large ISPs out there that all they do is pitch bandwidth. They never talk about how efficient it is,
Yeah.
and so you look at it, and most people are using, I don't know, 10% of their already paid for bandwidth, and then they're like, "Hey, I need more bandwidth." I'm like, "Why?" More
Yeah.
bandwidth isn't making that service go any faster. You can move more data, but you're not moving the data in the first place. So that's another bleed. That's a different type of bleed. I don't know if we're necessarily talking about it today, but yeah, there's having somebody able to take a look at that and saying, no, in fact, you can actually pay for less bandwidth and save some money because you're not using what you have now.
But that's the whole point of having professionals in IT that know all this stuff. Most people know it at a surface level, but you guys really understand it. And employee efficiency is a big one, because who here hasn't complained about, oh my gosh, my computer's not working, or is this running slow? That's the other one that I hear on chat sometimes. Is this thing running slow for everybody? Oh yeah. And then everybody kind of piles on and all right, well, and then what do you do when that happens? You just go, all right, well, I'm going to go do something else until this thing gets fixed.
that chat session alone, you think how much time and money is spent in just people talking about how slow their computer is. To be honest, I'm completely floored that Microsoft doesn't actually call you and tell you that you're over provisioned with your licensing. So that's, I'm joking. Like Microsoft's never going to call you.
Yeah. If you're watching and listening, they're not going to call.